to another exciting episode of You Don't Know. You don't know, huh? So don't act like you do. Because then something bad might happen to you. And I'm talking to you. Oh! A.N.THROPOS here with another episode of You Don't Know, a Basis, Texas production. Listen, there's been a lot of talk over the last year about one of the most compelling and exciting and convincing, quote-unquote, conspiracy theories to hit the scene in the modern day. And yes, in case you don't know, I am talking about Tartaria, the Tartarian Empire, and its related subjects: the mud flood, star forts, the reset. So what are all of these concepts and how do they fit together? And why is it so compelling? Well, let me give you an example. Recently in the news, they had the charming gentleman Jeffrey Epstein, where it reported that he committed suicide in a jail cell, and this man is a billionaire, or was a billionaire. If he's dead, we don't know. They say he's dead. They say he committed suicide. And he's also a convicted pedophile, and he has this, fuck island or sex island or something like that, where supposedly the Clintons have been out there, and just a whole laundry list, Denzel Washington, and just a whole laundry list of the Hollywood elite have been out there and had sex with people, prostitutes and stuff like that, and maybe even younger folks. So it's all very confusing, and don't know what to think. But here's the deal. With Jeffrey Epstein, okay, is he dead or is he not? If he is dead, did he commit suicide or was he murdered? Right? All of these questions come about. Listen, the truth is we'll probably never know. We'll probably never know because everything we're fed on the media is just a constant stream of lies. And we know this now. The entire reality that we're living in, this realm, is one big lie. Okay? But so what is different about the quote-unquote conspiracy theory of Tartaria, the Tartarian Empire? In a word, buildings. Buildings are what makes the difference. And in every town in the United States that's over a certain size, you have these old stone structures that some people call the colonial architecture. Sometimes it's called, Greco-Roman. Sometimes it's called Victorian. There's a lot of different names for it, but there are themes that are very closely related. And the bottom line is this: these buildings were not only buildings; they were devices. They were machines, and they were used for getting free energy, which could be converted into electricity. I assume from the aether, from the air, free power from the air, and that was what this ancient civilization was based on. And when I say ancient, I'm not talking about 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. I'm talking about 200 or 300 years ago. That's right, folks. That's one of the most disturbing and compelling and mysterious aspects of the Tartarian Empire enigma, shall we say. And that is that this stuff is very recent. Very, very recent indeed. And maybe as recent these cataclysms. Apparently there was one cataclysm, more than one cataclysm. The natural cataclysms, or maybe unnatural. Maybe there were solar flares that started earthquakes or something like this and created a big mud flood. Or maybe it was scalar weaponry fired from an airborne platform, like a plane, an early version of a plane. The hard part to wrap your mind around is the fact that this empire, the Tartarian Empire, we have every reason to believe that they were more advanced than we are today. Maybe in a little bit different way. Their technology may have been a little bit different, but still more advanced. And there's so many exciting and intriguing aspects of the Tartarian Empire enigma. I can't go into all of them now or even summarize them. But let me give you some of the most compelling aspects of the concept. New York City, Chicago, Seattle, Spokane, San Francisco, Omaha, Nebraska. These cities were not so much as founded as they were excavated. That's right, folks. These cities were literally dug out of the ground. And that's where you get the idea of the mud flood. And a lot of times this mud is in big hills. And when you see these stains on buildings, or you see a building where the windows are getting smaller and smaller like they're going into the hill, they don't build buildings like that, okay? They do not build a building halfway sticking out of and at an angle, even though the building's standing straight up, the dirt coming in at an angle and covering half the bottom floor windows. That dirt, that debris came later. And many of these buildings have just been boarded up, bricked up on the lower, aspects, or somewhat dug out. And you see this in even like in Friends, the old 80s sitcom. Or Jerry Seinfeld. He'd come out the steps and then look to the left and the right, and there would be people that had their apartments right there where you could look down into their little courtyard or into their window, basically, which was showing half a window there. Didn't you ever wonder about that? I mean, that's weird to have buildings like that where there's a half a, floor, and it's open to the elements. In other words, the rain's just pouring in there. It doesn't make any sense. And that's because those buildings were not engineered like that. What it is with these buildings is you're only seeing the top portion. Many, if not most of these buildings, there's 2 or 3 stories underneath the ground that's there. And you go down in there, and I've spoken with Matthew, my partner in the tiling company, and he's done some of these renovations and stuff in New York and other East Coast cities. And you go down into these basements, and the windows are there, or they were there. You can see that they were there, but then they've been bricked up. I mean, why would you have arched windows above ground, but also have arched windows below the ground that have been bricked up? It doesn't make any sense. So you see, these buildings were buried in mud. And so let's look at an interesting case, the case of Seattle, Washington. Okay, where were we here? We're at, Seattle, Washington. Oh, woo, Seattle, Washington. In good old Washington State. Oh, all right. So let's reference the Great Fire of Seattle in 1889. In 1889, I think somewhere around June, a fire swept through the business district of the downtown district of Seattle, decimating and destroying almost 90% of everything. Buildings burnt to a cinder. Now, they made quite a big boast of the pioneering spirit and the forward-moving spirit of the people of Seattle, as well they should have, because according to official record, over the next year, that's 1 year, over 3,000 buildings were built in Seattle. And that comes out to 10 buildings a day. And some of these buildings were big Gothic cathedral type churches and buildings like you see in a post office, sometimes prisons, government buildings, these big huge libraries, museums, these big Tartarian architecture, often called Victorian or Greco-Roman or colonial style architecture. What that really is Tartarian. And so at a city back then of 50,000 people built 3,000 buildings in 1 year using carts and horse and buggy type technology. That's 10 buildings a day with ornate masonry work and many stories going up into the sky. I mean, that's ridiculous. That's fucking ridiculous. They did not build 10 buildings a day when they're back in there in the Old West, you know, going around with Indians and, you know, covered wagons and shit like that. That's not what happened, all right? That is official story, however. And you see these same type of official stories all over the world in all of these, most of these major cities. And so it's just a bunch of outright lies, because these buildings were not built in a year. They were already there. They were probably excavated. You see New York, Chicago, San Francisco, Omaha, Nebraska, Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. These cities were not so much as founded as they were excavated. In other words, dug up. In other words, wrap your mind around this. I'm not saying that this is true, but this is kind of the gist of the concept of where this is going. And all of these buildings, let me tell you, were devices. But the idea is this, that when the Pilgrims landed on Plymouth Rock, the Empire State Building and the Manhattan Bridge were already there. The Pilgrims coming over on their ship, you know, the Mayflower and all that shit, and yo, ho ho, you know, and jump up on the shore. And the Empire State Building was already there, and the Manhattan Bridge. That is the bizarreness of the reality that we live in. It doesn't sound possible, does it? It's because you've been conditioned with lies your entire life. All you have to do is look at this Tartarian information a very little bit to see that it is absolutely very real. Irrefutable, in fact. Because the evidence is there. The evidence is the buildings themselves. And then you have the concepts that go along with the Tartarian Empire, and that is mud flood, star forts, free energy from the sky, from the aether, organs, like big organs in churches. All these big cathedrals and stuff were not actually houses of worship. They were power stations that got free energy from the air, but they were also they were actually weapons. These stained glass windows served to be some kind of filter or aiming device for the organs, which was a sonic type of weapon, which was had a multi-purpose type of machine, because it also soothed the masses. I don't know if you'd want to call it a mind control, but it kept everybody on an even keel. Fascinating, isn't it? And then, and as if that hadn't got weird enough, then you add in the aspect of giants. Yes, you heard me, giants. Those giants, the big motherfuckers, okay? Abraham Lincoln spoke of giants in one of his most famous speeches, given at Niagara Falls, saying that we're looking out over Niagara Falls with the same, just as these giants were that came before us. So at one point in American history, it was common knowledge that giants had existed all over North America. And that fact was covered up to a great degree by the Smithsonian Institute. Now, many of you have heard of my book, My Family Created the National Security State, and in parentheses, no need to thank me. And if you know about that, then you know that my great uncle, the late congressional leader George Mahon, controlled every dime of the United States defense budget for over 40 years. That's Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, every dime, okay? This is not a secret. He also created some agencies that you've probably never heard of, with names like the NSA, the CIA, the FBI, and NASA. And so I show a picture here that I show a lot. It's a picture with Gerald Ford, Werner von Braun, the rocket scientist, the Nazi SS officer, who later got put in charge of NASA, and then my great uncle George Mahon, all in this picture. And you see my great uncle created another thing called Operation Paperclip, which brought all these Nazi scientists to the United States. He was also in charge of the Manhattan Project. He was also in charge of MK Ultra, Majestic 12, the national, the policy of 1947, the National Security Act of 1947, which just so happens to be the same year that the term flying saucer was coined. Also happens to be the same year where we had Roswell also happens to be the same year that a young man, Jack Parsons, and another man, Ron L. Hubbard, who are both in the OTO, which I'm in, a secret society which I'm in, and they went out into the desert and with a young lady, they tried the Babylon working ritual to try to bring the Antichrist into the world. So it was a heady time. It was a heady year. It was a big year, 1947. Had to kind of give that background information because what I'm going to tell you now is that after my great uncle retired from being basically one of the most powerful men in the world, controlled all the money of the United States defense budget, he retired and then he went to work. He got another job and got put on the board of directors of, you guessed it, the Smithsonian. The very institute that has been, we've told, is created to enrich our lives, but really it's created to dumb us down and to cover up the evidence. Absolutely. You don't know, huh? So don't act like you do. Because then something bad might happen to you. And I'm talking to you. Oh.